Hey everybody, this is the Holy Hand Grenade. Welcome to the show. Taking every thought captive, we assault the boundaries of reality in this quantum game of hide and seek. It's a new perspective of Earth from Earth. This is the Reality Distortion Effect on Take on the World TV.
Franklin was a member of Masonic and secret orders in America, in England, and in France, the three countries involved in the American Revolution. But some researchers argue that his influence in France truly demonstrates his loyalty to a plan that looked beyond America to a global revolution.
He was the master of the Lodge of the Nine Sisters, Neuchoir, the Lodge of the Nine Sisters right in Paris, and that's where the revolution started, incidentally. So he was lodge master there every time he visited the place.
He, as so many young people, very intelligent people, really believed that man could create a better society without being totally reliant upon God. And of course, we know that eventually he went to France, and when he was in France as the American ambassador to France, he was instrumental in pushing these ideas that led to the French Revolution.
Franklin went to France to convince King Louis XVI to finance the American Revolution. But in the process, Franklin was preaching radical ideas that would later on inspire the French to overthrow Louis, the very monarch who had helped to pave for the founding of America. Americans desperately needed money to fight the War of Independence because, according to Franklin, England had ruined their economy to keep America from becoming too prosperous.
When he was ambassador to England, the Bank of England said, how come America, the representatives of the Bank of England said, how come America is getting so rich? And Franklin, in his autobiography, recounts the story. He said, well, that's easy. In America, we create our own money and we owe no interest to pay to no one. So the Bank of England said, oh, that's very interesting. So they immediately had passed through Parliament the Currency Act of 1764. And what did the Currency Act do? It outlawed the creation of America's own money and put America on the gold standard, made Americans pay their taxes in gold or silver coin, which of course was very scarce in the American colonies in those days. So what was the result? It immediately plunged America into a deep depression. Franklin says that this depression, and everyone in America was well aware of what the depression, who caused the depression, why it was caused, just because England outlawed America just simply printing its own money, and that it was this Currency Act of 1764 that was really the root cause of the American Revolution, because it caused so much unemployment and a terrible economic upheaval. And Franklin's quote is, we could have endured a little tax on tea and other matters, but it was England's taking away our ability to create our own currency that was really the root cause of the revolution.
And so King Louis supported the American cause through financial aid and the use of troops. But some years later, many of the French soldiers who fought for America would return to France to fight the French Revolution. Among their leaders would be an American hero, the Marquis de Lafayette, who served alongside George Washington. Lafayette was also a Freemason and close acquaintance of Benjamin Franklin, the man who seemed to be the friend of nearly all the revolutionaries of the day.
It was Benjamin Franklin who initiated Voltaire himself in 1778. He could then brag and say, oh, Voltaire was a Mason. Ooh. People would say, if it's good enough for him, it must be good enough for me. I don't know what it's all about, but it sounds like a good thing.
While the writings of Voltaire inspired the French revolutionaries, Americans were compelled by another of Franklin's close friends, Thomas Paine.
Thomas Paine was a member of the Lunar Society. Benjamin Franklin would go and meet with them. Yeah. Anyway, he recognized in Thomas Paine that the fellow was, he was pretty good at writing. And so he brought him back with him to Philadelphia. And he wrote the pamphlets that started the revolution in America. It was a little booklet called Common Sense. Thomas Paine wrote that, and it was kind of inciting people to war against King George III.
With the help of Paine and his fellow Masons, Franklin worked to create the revolutionary mentality among the colonies.
Yes, Franklin developed the concept of the virtuous revolution. The thought of revolting against a monarch amongst European people was absolutely anathema. It went totally against the European mindset of the divine right of kings, where government is of God, kings are appointed by God, and so the virtuous revolution was something really different.
But not all Masons went along with Franklin's ideas, like the man known as the Great American Trader, Benedict Arnold, also a Mason who chose to side with the British during the war. Nevertheless, for good or for ill, Masonry was clearly at the helm of the War of Independence. It seems ironic, however, that American Masonry today owes its allegiance to the very country it rebelled against. Modern Masons trace their official beginning to the United Grand Lodge of England, founded in 1717.
The official start of modern Masonry is in 1717 in the Apple Tree Tavern in London, where the first Grand Lodge of England was convened. And that's called the Mother Lodge, because essentially all English-speaking lodges precipitate out of that. And for example, all American lodges, all the different Grand Lodges of the different states, all ultimately owe their allegiance and their warrant to the Grand Lodge of England.
Yet prior to the formation of the Grand Lodge, the seeds of modern Masonry had already been sown through the work of Francis Bacon.
Francis Bacon established the Masonic organization, that whole body that was established by Francis Bacon. The ethical programs that were inherent within that, he was responsible for all those. His philosophy, his ethics, his literature that he was responsible for would certainly be known to Benjamin Franklin.
Was Franklin following Bacon's plan? Was it mere coincidence that he was a chief catalyst in the launching of the American Revolution? Or that his influence would also bring about the revolution in France? Masonic philosopher Manly P. Hall wrote that not only were many American founders Masons, but they received aid from a secret and august body existing in Europe, which helped them to establish this country for a peculiar and particular purpose, known only to the initiated few. Hall further suggests that Benjamin Franklin was among those few. In his book, The Secret Destiny of America, Hall writes of Franklin's involvement with the plan of Francis Bacon. In Chapter 13, titled Bacon's Secret Society Set Up in America, Hall features an illustration showing the eastern seaboard with Benjamin Franklin overseeing it, while beside him is the shadow of Bacon. Hall claims that Franklin spoke for the secret societies, and that most of the men who worked with him in the early days of the American Revolution were also members. He says, quote, "The plan was working out. The new Atlantis was coming into being in accordance with the program laid down by Francis Bacon." To those who have studied him, Sir Francis Bacon is one of the most enigmatic figures in world history. Baconian societies have existed for centuries since his death in 1626. All of them credit Bacon with the great advancements of the New World.
Bacon is such an interesting character, such a complex character. He was right at the center of the storm politically. He even claimed in one of his writings that he was in possession of all knowledge. You can't say that he was ignorant of the Christian concept. He obviously had some concept of Christianity and speaks of the Lord Jesus Christ, and yet he's a proponent of the New Atlantis concept. Just a very complicated character.
Bacon is known as the father of modern science, and the grandfather of the English Enlightenment. The phrase, knowledge is power, is often attributed to him and represents his philosophy, that through knowledge or science, mankind could transform himself and the world into its highest state of enlightenment. His dedication to science and learning led to the birth of England's premier scientific organization. When the Royal Society of England was formed in 1662, they named Bacon as their model and inspiration.
There's a book written by Thomas Sprat, who was the first president of the Royal Society. So this goes back to the early 1700s, and he wrote a history on it. And he acknowledged there that Francis Bacon was the originator of the idea.
Yet even beyond the Royal Society, 20th century historian Will Durant wrote that the whole tenor and career of British thought have followed the philosophy of Bacon, a philosophy brought to America and furthered by some of her most influential leaders. Thomas Jefferson considered Francis Bacon one of the three most important men in history, along with John Locke and Sir Isaac Newton. It is even said that Jefferson believed he was fulfilling Bacon's dream for a new Atlantis by founding the United States. As a result, nearly all Baconians credit Bacon with the founding of America. This painting, once owned by Baconian author Marie Bauer Hall, shows the North American continent with the spirit of Bacon rising from the midst. Above his head is the all-seeing eye of Horus in the midst of a triangle, while upon his cloak is the rose and cross, the symbol of his Rosicrucians. Despite these things, little is mentioned about Lord Bacon in the history books of America. There are no states, cities, towns, or schools named after him, which begs the question, other than Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, which of the founding fathers did he really influence?
Which of those founding fathers were most influenced by Bacon's work? I would suggest it was all those who were Freemasons.
Well, I think probably all the first presidents of America who were Freemasons, you could say, were influenced by him because of the influence that went into Freemasonry, but by Bacon. But I expect some were more influenced than others, or more inspired than others, and some may not even have known that Bacon was behind it all, in the sense of an inspirer. But maybe they all did. I mean, they were pretty intelligent men.
Bacon is considered by some to be the first Grand Master of modern Freemasonry. While the craft would not be officially established until after his death, it was Bacon who mapped out the plan for the ultimate aim of Masonry and all secret societies, the establishment of a new Atlantis. Peter Dawkins is the founder and president of the Francis Bacon Research Trust in England. He has dedicated more than 33 years to the study of Bacon, having written some 14 books about him, with titles such as Building Paradise and Francis Bacon, Herald of the New Age.
My research into the life and work of Francis Bacon and all those connected with him, which also takes me back into the wisdom traditions, which I'm very interested in, and into also things like the founding of America, the spread of modern science, and many other fascinating subjects. It's like a gateway into a huge wealth of information and knowledge for today.
Dawkins' work is supported by the Pro-Grand Master of English Masonry, the Marquis de Northampton. The Grand Master in England is Prince Edward, the Duke of Kent. Because he is a member of the royal family, Masonry allows Prince Edward to appoint someone to act in his place. As such, the Pro-Grand Master, Lord Northampton, is the acting head of all British Freemasonry. While he declined to be interviewed for this documentary, in his correspondence with our producer, he made it clear that he supports Dawkins' research and considers him an expert on Sir Francis Bacon. This is significant because the Northampton legacy dates back to the time of Bacon and Queen Elizabeth I. Today, Lord Northampton holds authority over Canonbury Tower, where Francis Bacon lived in his lifetime and where he is said to have met with his secret societies.
It's a fascinating building, and quite a lot of it's still left. It was once a big mansion house, and there's one wing of it left, and also a tower, which was at the end of another wing, which has disappeared. And this tower is known as Canonbury Tower. And the whole mansion itself was enlarged and decorated by a man called Sir John Spencer in Queen Elizabeth's time. And he'd had a year as Lord Mayor. He was quite an important guy in the City of London, and very, very wealthy merchant. And he had a home in London itself. And he also had Canonbury Mansion as his country home, because then it was in the country. Now it's just surrounded by London, part of London, but then it was in the country, up on a hill, and a wonderful place to go to get the country air, and good for your health. And Sir John Spencer was clearly involved with Freemasonry and the early Rosicrucian group, and he embellished all the rooms of the house with special carvings on the oak panelling, which have Masonic and Rosicrucian themes. And particularly the fireplaces are done very, very carefully and specially. But the Compton and Spencer rooms still have the original carved panelling in, and the carved fireplaces, full of Masonic and Rosicrucian themes. That was done by Sir John Spencer, and the carvings are dated around about 1598 to 1601, that period. Well, eventually the house was taken over by Francis Bacon when he was made Lord Keeper of the Great Seal and then Lord Chancellor, and he rented the house for the rest of his life. And it's during this time that what's called the Invisible College was founded, and many other things were done, and he's known to have carried out scientific experiments there. And it's quite clear too that the house was the perfect meeting place for his Rosicrucian group. It was a headquarters outside London. It was private in those days. It could be well protected out of prying eyes.
This labor of pursuing knowledge in secret represents Bacon's belief and method of working. In his New Atlantis, he wrote of a society that observed all things, but was known by no one. The symbolism of Bacon's home at Canonbury Tower, with all its mystery, supports the mystical view of the man, held by Dawkins himself.
Well, using sort of Eastern terms, I'd say he was a master, but what in India they call a real master. But he was here in Europe, in the UK, or in England at that time. And he was just an extraordinary being. I actually think that he was the one that Paracelsus made the prophecy about, called Elias the Artist, referring to Elijah. And in tradition, Elijah is said to come again and again to prepare people for the coming of the Messiah, or coming of the Christ, which has many different interpretations. And Bacon himself called himself the herald of the New Age, which is the title of Elijah.
The question posed by critics of Baconian theology is, what Christ did Bacon come to herald? Was it the Christ of the Bible, or the Christ of Masonry and the ancient mystery religion? In the ancient mysteries, a trinity is also recognized, and is represented by a symbol that is little talked about, but one that some believe stands at the heart of all the Masonic tradition. It is known as the 47th proposition of Euclid, or the Pythagorean theorem. Manly P. Hall illustrates and explains the occult symbolism of this theorem in his book, The Secret Teachings of All Ages. According to Hall, the right triangle represents this trinity. The perpendicular side symbolizes the masculine or divine father, while the base represents the feminine or divine mother. Finally, the hypotenuse is looked upon as the offspring of them both, the divine child, who is sometimes called the Masonic Christ. Was this what Bacon came to herald? A Christ that delivers man through knowledge or science? According to Peter Dawkins, Bacon's desire was to deliver mankind from the fall he had suffered in the Garden of Eden, to restore him to paradise through what he called the 6 days' work.
So he always believed that as man was made in the image of God, as the Bible says, therefore we should imitate what God does. All his work imitates what he's learned from the Bible and from the interpretations of the Bible. And so the 6 days' work of creation is how to create paradise, because that's in the Bible what's created as a result of the 6 days' work. So he calls his great instauration also the 6 days' work, 6 days' work of creation. And it's all planned out according to what he understood about what those 6 days or stages of creation can mean when interpreted into the human role, what human beings can do.
While Bacon based his understanding on the Bible, Dawkins admits that his approach was not through traditional Christian doctrine, but rather a mystical view based in the teachings of Kabbalah.
He worked like a Kabbalist. He was a master of the Kabbalah, and particularly the Christian Kabbalah. The Kabbalah goes back through the Hebrews, through Moses, to ancient Egypt, and before that it's said to Enoch, who was the great initiate and king of Atlantis. And it said all the teachings come from Enoch, including this Kabbalah. And Bacon was a great master of Kabbalah. His whole work is based on Kabbalistic principles.
While explaining Kabbalah could go on indefinitely, it might be generally called the Jewish version of the ancient mystery religion. In the modern world, Kabbalah has gained popularity among celebrities and is practiced by Barbra Streisand, Mick Jagger, Roseanne Barr, Britney Spears, Jeff Goldblum, Elizabeth Taylor, Paris Hilton, Demi Moore, Winona Ryder, and of course Madonna, who has become a principal spokesman, much to the objection of some traditional Jews. In short, Kabbalah is designed to lead mankind to perfection, where man becomes a godlike being. It is a system that goes hand in hand with the concept of building paradise on earth. Sir Francis Bacon, the great Kabbalist, believed that the pursuit of science, or knowledge, was the way to achieve this great work.
Most schoolboys used to know who Francis Bacon was and what he contributed to our knowledge today, and it was the method of science.
Well, his first most public and fundamental effect he had was to form the basis of modern science, which is the experimental method. So he promoted what Socrates had also promoted, which was to not just think in your mind and argue, through arguments and so on, which is an Aristotelian method, but actually go out and look what is there in reality, in nature, and study nature and derive your thoughts and ideas from that and base experiments on that to see if they work. Then if they work and if they're useful, and they're proved useful over a length of time, then you might consider you've got perhaps a bit of truth. And then you build on that. Well, up to Bacon's time, most of what one could call science, which was not really properly existing as such, except in the mystery schools, in all university, academia and so on, was just producing arguments after argument.
You see, up until Bacon's day, it was the church that was in control. And in fact, the church was in control up until about the 1800s. So the church was in control, but the church hierarchy wasn't necessarily pure Christian. There was a lot of people that were there because they could handle 3 or 4 languages and they had great intellect, but were they Christians? Real Christians? No, likely they were not. They knew their scripture, of course, but they were operating by the world system, and so the world system corrupted them.
This corruption extended to their powers of discernment. While the Bible teaches that men should prove all things, many church academics in the Middle Ages trusted in an unsound method of deductive reasoning based upon a faulty understanding of the scriptures.
And typically it would go this way. To give an example, they would take from the book of Acts where it says, and the gospel was preached to the whole world. That's one statement. Now the common statement that goes with that is, but the disciples and the apostles never went to the whole world. And therefore you could deduce from those 2 statements that, well, there were no people on the other side of the world to preach to. You see, well, obviously were, because the explorers found there were people in Australia and Tasmania. Years later, they found that. So there were other people on the other side of the world. So you see, they got the wrong deduction using that method of deduction. And that's what Francis Bacon pointed out. He said, there's so much nonsense.
And so Bacon set out to establish a scientific method, one by which mankind might achieve all knowledge. Through this method, Bacon sought to bring forth a light that would eventually disclose and bring into sight all that is most hidden and secret in the universe. But first, he would have to find a way to overcome the stubborn traditions employed by the academics of his day, who would rather debate than examine.
Bacon gives a great example in exasperation. When he was at university, he saw that there were professors and students spent 3 or 4 years debating how many teeth a horse has. Nobody went out to actually count them. They just wasted all that time debating how many teeth a horse has. So he saw that as fruitless, wasn't producing anything good or useful, and humanity just was not evolving, and there's so many people in poverty and sickness. So he wanted to relieve that poverty and sickness and get us towards a future paradise, a world paradise, not just for the England, but for the world. So he really started the whole principles of modern science, which is this experimental method. And then he had a formula to start with the basics, the physical world, which is physics, physical laws, and then work upwards towards metaphysics and so on. He couldn't talk too openly when it got to metaphysics because it landed him in trouble with the religions of the time who were at war with each other. So he had to do that in a more careful way, a more veiled way. But right about it he did.
Bacon's metaphysical ideas led him into teachings that would have been condemned by both the Catholic and Protestant churches of his day. He is said to have made contact with the spirit realm, and that upon hearing a heavenly voice, he was given his life's work. To protect himself, he kept his practices veiled within secret societies. In particular, the ancient Brotherhood of the Rose and Cross. The Rosicrucians had long believed that powers and principalities from the spirit realm possessed secret knowledge that might be used for the benefit of mankind. These and other teachings were to be kept hidden from those considered profane, and especially from the church.
The Rosicrucians had to be a secret society. Their object was to discover God's truths after him. But some of their methodology was bordering on witchcraft. For instance, the transmutation of base metals into gold. They claimed they could do it. I don't think so. They claim that they could communicate with angels and demons. Well, in the first place, the scripture tells you not to do it. But their idea was that if you could do that, surely those people, those creatures at least, the angels and the demons, they know a lot of things that we don't know. After all, they've been around since time immemorial, and they are familiar with heaven itself, so surely they can tell us many secrets. Well, the church, you see, would take a dim view of that, and they could be put to death for that sort of thing.
The Rosicrucian Society had been formed in England prior to Bacon's birth, in part for the purpose of protecting Queen Elizabeth I. In the 16th century, the conflict between Roman Catholicism and the Protestant Church of England was at its peak. Mary Tudor, the daughter of King Henry VIII, took the throne and earned the title Bloody Mary.
They were looking for another heir, and so there were no boy heirs of, or no legal boy heirs of Henry, but he had daughters. And so we have Mary. And Mary was now 37, she was one of his daughters, and so she was installed as queen, and that was just after he died, so that would be in 58. And she was a Catholic, a dyed-in-the-wool Catholic, and she had actually married Prince Philip II of Spain. Of course, he was a Catholic too. So the first thing that Mary did was to repeal those laws which permitted the Protestants to practice their religion. Repealed them and then forcefully put to death as many Christians that were of the Protestant faith as she could find. Within the confines of the data that we have, she put to death 300, so there was 300 martyrs there that we know about in the short 6-year reign that she had.
No one was safe from Mary's wrath against the so-called Protestant heretics, not even her own sister. Elizabeth Tudor was also the daughter of King Henry VIII, with his second wife, Anne Boleyn, whom Henry had married after divorcing Catherine of Aragon, the mother of Queen Mary.
When she was installed as queen, she put her sister, Elizabeth I, in jail because she was suspected of being a Protestant, so she went to the Tower of London.
While imprisoned in the Tower, Elizabeth formed a friendship with a mysterious member of the court, a mathematician and mystic named Dr. John Dee.
He was known in the early Elizabethan days as the real wise man, the magus, and he was into a lot of esoteric study. He was certainly an initiate of the wisdom traditions.
Dr. John Dee was one of the foremost geniuses of his day.
John Dee was 34 years older than Francis Bacon, and John Dee was a mathematician, lived in London. He was a mathematician and astrologer to Queen Mary, Tudor, and that's Bloody Mary.
While Dee began in Mary's service, he soon fell out of favor because of his bizarre experiments, and some say his friendship with Elizabeth. In any case, Dee was imprisoned under suspicion of sorcery, an accusation that would follow him throughout his life, and one that seems not unfounded, considering his system of magic is still practiced by many occultists to this day.
One thing that he is most noted for today among occultists is that he and a fellow named Edward Kelly, who was a medium, did magical invocations related to the Book of Enoch to produce an entire, what today is called the Enochian system of magic. And it's this incredibly complex language and alphabet and cubes and magic squares, and it's extremely complex, and it's very, very powerful.
In his quest for knowledge, Dee tapped into the powers of the beyond, hoping to learn secrets from the spirit realm.
But that's not to say he wasn't trying to communicate with angels. He did. And they can be contacted and talked with. Roughly it means messengers of God. So that's what Dee was trying to do in his own way. But he obviously was too open about it. So in the end, he got persecuted for this.
But not everyone saw Dee's dabbling as communicating with angels of God. Dee once wrote that he was looked upon as a companion of hellhounds, a caller and a conjurer of wicked and damned spirits. Yet, like Bacon, he practiced much of his craft in secret, as an active member of the Rosicrucians in England. Some even credit Dee with founding the modern Rosicrucian movement. As such, communing with angelic beings that provide scientific knowledge was a familiar practice.
Now, there was a pretty very brief and shady dividing line between what they called scientific knowledge and what we might call outright witchcraft today. It was the demarcation there was very shadowy.
This shadowy line was one that Dee crossed many times. Yet for a while, he flourished under the reign of Queen Elizabeth. During this era, some believe that he was a kind of mentor to Sir Francis Bacon.
Well, we know from Dee's diary that Bacon made one visit, at least, to Dr. John Dee's home at Mortlake. And when these visits were recorded, Dee was meaning people had come to talk with Dee and discuss esoteric matters with him and to use his library and so on like that. So we know that's a historical record we have. Otherwise, it's circumstantial evidence. Bacon clearly knew Dr. John Dee because he was an important person in Queen Elizabeth's court, and Francis Bacon was a courtier.
Perhaps the reason for the lack of records in Bacon's relationship with John Dee is that their work was done behind the veil of secret societies.
There's always been these secret societies trying to promote learning and raise the level of people's thought and culture to a kinder level and higher level. But mostly they've worked in secret because the church, most of the different churches have been so, not very kind.
The problem we're dealing with here is that Europeans discovered an awful lot of information, and very important, good, solid information of sciences that had been, developed richly elsewhere and that were brought into Europe and were so threatening to Christianity that they had to be suppressed. We know what happened to Galileo, and we know what happened to endless numbers of Giordano Bruno and so many others in science. They had to go underground. So the process of forcing knowledge and wisdom underground created a lot of coding and a lot of buzzwords and a lot of secret gestures and terms that still aren't understood to this day. So Dee is amongst that group.
While men such as Galileo were persecuted for representing scientific knowledge, the secret societies of the Elizabethan era were in danger not for the knowledge they possessed, but how they obtained it through occult practices of summoning spirits and conjuring demons. They were, nevertheless, determined to continue for the cause of science and learning. Dr. John Dee led the way in this arena. His method became known as angel magic because of his contact with spirits that Dee believed were sometimes good and sometimes evil. At one point, Dee's angels compelled him to visit the Holy Roman Emperor, Rudolph II, and tell him that he was wicked and that if he did not repent, God would throw him down. Incredibly, Dee obeyed the angels, visited the emperor, and established a friendship that would help to protect him from persecution later on. In his experiments, Dee worked with a medium named Edward Kelly. Kelly was the one who often made contact with the spirits Dee communed with. In a diary entry of June 8, 1584, Dee records a startling account. He claims that Kelly was greatly troubled when the angels tried to persuade him that Jesus was not God, and that no prayers ought to be made to him. They further claimed that sin did not really exist, and that man's soul simply moves from one body to another, in what sounds like reincarnation. Upon hearing this, Kelly was apparently distraught and believed they had contacted evil spirits. Nevertheless, the angels provided Dr. Dee with gifts of knowledge. Dee was the first to apply Euclidean geometry to navigation. He built the instruments for and trained the first great navigators. He is credited with coining the word Britannia, or Britain, and his influence laid the foundation for what would become the British Empire. He made his own maps and is said to have charted the northeast and northwest passages in his attempts to increase the wealth of England by gaining access to the New World. And believe it or not, the New World has been secretly influenced by his example. John Dee is considered the original wizard. He was the inspiration for the character of Prospero in Shakespeare's The Tempest, and for Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. In the modern world, Dee was the role model for J.K. Rowling's Albus Dumbledore in the Harry Potter books, the character of Gandalf in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, and even Ian Fleming's James Bond. Few people know that John Dee was the original Agent 007 in Her Majesty's Secret Service.
Ian Fleming got the idea for his designation 007 for James Bond from the fact that that was how John Dee would sign his correspondence when he was overseas working as a spy for Queen Elizabeth. He would always sign his name 007. And that's where the concept came in for James Bond. Because James Bond was originally intended to be kind of a modern day Dr. John Dee, although it never really developed that way.
While Dee's character continues to intrigue, some would argue that compelling the imaginations of literary minds was not his greatest influence. This image shows what appears to be a wizened old man passing a lamp in the dead of night to a younger man in Elizabethan clothing. Baconians believe this old world engraving represents Dr. John Dee passing the lamp of esoteric knowledge and wisdom to his successor, Francis Bacon. Both Bacon and Dee were men of science, dedicated to the advancement of learning. Both men were members of the Rosicrucian Society, of which Bacon would become the chief. Like Bacon, John Dee believed that America was indeed the lost continent of Atlantis. But where did he get this idea? Was it given to him by his angels? And did he pass this concept on to Francis Bacon? We can only speculate. But when Queen Elizabeth took the throne, the dream of colonizing this new Atlantis would come closer to being a reality.
When Bloody Mary, as she was called, this was Mary Tudor, who had been now on the throne and persecuting the Christians, and she died, perhaps ironically, with a false pregnancy. And so when she died in 1558, then after that, Elizabeth I came in as queen. And so there were questions of what day should be chosen for Elizabeth's coronation.
The coronation of a new ruler was an important event, the timing of which, it was believed, could determine the success or failure of a monarch's reign. To ensure her good fortune, Elizabeth called upon her old friend, Dr. John Dee.
He was the Queen's astrologer too. He computed the date for her to be crowned.
Astrology in those days didn't mean necessarily what we understand it to mean today. There were some odd things about it, but there was a study of the stars that we would call today astronomy. So they had to know about the movements of the stars and the planets, and they were pretty knowledgeable about that. So it was a strange mixture of astrology and astronomy. So that's what he was doing.
It's debatable how the efforts of Dee's astrology impacted the course of England. But when the new queen took the throne, it marked the beginning of an unprecedented era in English history. During this time, the language of the New World would be transformed, ancient knowledge would unfold, and the course of the philosophic empire would be established. The modern world would be changed forever, largely because of Queen Elizabeth I.
And she was bright. This was Queen Elizabeth of England, one of the brightest queens that England has ever had. Whether she was a true Christian or not was perhaps doubtful, but at least she did support the Protestant cause and not the Catholic one.
The Queen's Protestant faith made her immediate enemies in Rome. In April of 1570, Pope Pius V issued a papal bull excommunicating her from, quote, the unity of the body of Christ.
Well, that meant that the Pope was saying to all the Catholic kings of Europe, go and invade England, kill the Queen, take over the country, make it Catholic, and I'll give you my blessing. So that was a huge threat to England and the Queen. So the English, who didn't like that, didn't like that idea, they formed a close-knit protection around the Queen and their country.
To answer the threat of spies and assassins from Rome, the English set up an intelligence network under the leadership of Sir Francis Walsingham, known as the Queen's Spy Master. Among his secret agents were Dr. John Dee and later on Sir Francis Bacon, along with their Rosicrucian Society, which is said to have been formed in England for the purpose of protecting Elizabeth. But some suspect the Order of the Rose and Cross had yet another agenda.
I think they would have definitely been on the Protestant side of things. They would have had a vested interest in using all of their both political savvy and occult savvy to protect the Queen, but I also think they had an esoteric agenda as well.
This society had a very esoteric base. Behind it had links with the wisdom societies, the wisdom traditions throughout Europe, and inherited a lot of that wisdom light being passed on. And so they had an inner program which was to try to raise consciousness of society.
According to Bacon, Rosicrucianism seemed to represent the very heart and focus of the entire New Atlantis concept.
Francis Bacon's last book that he was writing at the time when he allegedly died, that was 1626, but his last book was called The New Atlantis, and the subtitle was The Land of the Rosicrucians.
Why the land of the Rosicrucians, or Rosicrucians? Why did Bacon deem their influence to be so important?
Rosicrucianism gets its name from the symbols, the main symbols used, and that's the rose and the cross. But these are very ancient symbols. They go back long way in time, and being used by different societies for thousands of years.
In the hands of different societies, the symbol has been interpreted in a variety of ways. There is the decipherment of the rose that received much attention in Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code.
The rose is a symbol of secrecy, and the term in Latin that characterized the relationship of the rose to secrecy was sub rosa, meaning under the rose. So secret orders world round, when they swear to secrecy, swear sub rosa.
The secrecy of the rose represents the hidden knowledge of the ancient mystery religion, while the cross symbolizes Christianity. The combining of these two is what defines the belief of nearly all the secret orders.
The symbology there is the infusion of all this Eastern Persian spirituality into Christianity.
Was this fusion of beliefs a part of Bacon's plan? And what sort of impact could it have? The Reformers argued that the mixture of paganism and Christianity is what produced the Dark Ages. Would Bacon's program of the Rose and Cross be a blessing or a curse? And how would this whole thing be carried out?
When one follows the Rosicrucian trail, John Dee was a very, very key influence in historical Rosicrucians, and some say even the founder of it, the first president of it. But at some point, the presidency was given over to Francis Bacon, and he was in charge of the Rosicrucians, not just in England, but it spread right through Europe, and was following Bacon's particular program. And outwardly, Bacon called his program the advancement of proficiency of learning.
This advancement of learning represented Bacon's desire to transform the world through knowledge. But he recognized that the key to obtaining knowledge was in a people's ability to communicate. As such, Bacon worked to reform the English language in ways never before realized.
And it is a bit strange that the English language, as crude as it was in the time of Bacon's youth, by the time he died, it was becoming one of the most refined languages. But in England at that time, the English was dreadful. It was garbled with all kinds of different dialects, because if you think about it, England was made up of the Saxons, the Danes, the Gauls who had invaded, they were the Frenchmen, and they had a whole mixture of languages. So very often one Englishman could not communicate with another.
To address the problem, Bacon surrounded himself with writers and poets who were like-minded.
All these people, these kind of intellectual people, they all read and wrote in Latin, but they said, look, we need an English language. We're going to be a great country, so they needed a language and literature. So how to develop that skill? And that's what I think that's principally what Bacon did.
He gathered around him a literary society, of writers, poets, artists as well, and some of them were employed to as part of the Secret Service of Queen Elizabeth, and they had communications with people all over Europe, in all the different countries of Europe, and from their letters they derived the roots of new English words, which they invented and put out.
These new words were put out through a variety of literary works, books and poems and plays of the theater. Bacon's circle of writers and poets were largely responsible for the explosion of English literature during the Elizabethan era. They included such notable authors as Ben Jonson, Christopher Marlowe, Sir Walter Raleigh, and Edmund Spenser, to name a few. In addition, Bacon was dedicated to bringing the sacred knowledge of the ancient world to English-speaking people, knowledge otherwise kept hidden by the barriers of language.
When he died, and subsequent to that, they've culled together at least 2,000 books. Not books that he wrote, because obviously one man couldn't write that number, but he had what he called a scriptorium. These were scribes who he paid to write for him. When he was the Lord High Chancellor of England, he had wealth, and he used to pay the scriptorium, these scribes, and he paid people to translate the classic books, Homer's Iliad, all the old Greek and the Roman classics, and all those classics, Livy, translate them all into English and put them in books. It turns out too that Bacon had a printing press. He had a factory with using brass plates for printing. That was his own thing. Nobody knew about that until rather recently. But nevertheless, there were 2,000 works that we know of that passed through his hands in one way or another to give literacy to the English public. Printing presses to make these books available to many people at a cheap price.
But Bacon's purpose and that of his literary society was to prepare the people of the old world to colonize the land of the new. As the term colonization scheme suggests, the launching of Bacon's plan for America was not by chance, but by design. It could be said that his great scheme began at an early age, perhaps when he was sent by Queen Elizabeth I to the court of France, where he was inspired by the example of the French poets.
Another major influence, he obviously was inspired in France by the French Pleiades, the group of French poets who were deliberately trying to make the French language into a really good language particularly for poetry and writings and so on of that sort. And Bacon spent several years at the French court, came back very inspired, and wanted to do the same thing for the English language.
Upon his return to England, he was sent to study law at the prestigious Gray's Inn in London, where his statue can be seen today. It was here that Bacon formed the beginnings of his own literary society, a secret group known as the Knights of the Helmet.
The Knights of the Helmet it's actually the name of a masque he wrote, or it's thought he must have written, because masques were put together by a lot of people for the royal court or for the Inns of Court, which was where the lawyers were. And to get a job as a lawyer or a minister or official in the government, you had to be, first of all, a lawyer, and you had to know how the royal court worked. So every year they had to put on huge celebrations imitating the royal court, and part of that celebration was masks. And many people were involved in creating these entertainments with their masks. Francis Bacon was just one of them, but he became a key one, and he wrote quite a lot of the mask material, which one can identify. You know, once you get to know Bacon and his writings, you can identify what was done. And he's acclaimed by the lawyers as being the great one who inspired them and led them and wrote for them, you know. But the Knights of the Helmets was the name of one of the masks at a key moment when the whole Shakespeare authorship, the name the Shakespeare was being used for the first time.
The Knights of the Helmet took as their inspiration the Greek goddess Pallas Athena, who carried a spear and who wore a great helmet, a symbol of secrecy.
According to tradition, one that wears the helmet of Athena becomes invisible. And they had to swear allegiance to it. And not only that, Athena, the goddess Athena, carried a spear that she shook in the eyes of ignorance. And she was one of the greatest goddesses among the Greeks, ruling through intellect and man's wisdom.
Even as Dr. John Dee had been inspired by angelic beings, some researchers believe that a spiritual encounter with Pallas Athena gave Bacon the inspiration for his life's work.
Well, in some of those cipher writings that he had written, he writes there how this, he heard an heavenly voice.
The voice he heard inspired him towards secrecy and to imitate the work of God.
The Divine Majesty takes delight to hide his work, according to the innocent play of children. Surely for thee to follow the example of the Most High God cannot be censored. Therefore, put away popular applause, and after the manner of Solomon the king, compose a history of thy time, and fold it into enigmatical writings and cunning mixtures of the theatre.
That was his mission in life. And for the rest of Bacon's life, he was dedicated to that one purpose.
Baconian scholars believe that Bacon's revelation led him to develop a series of theatrical works that would teach the English people and transform them into a nation that could one day dominate the world and resurrect the Atlantean dream. Believing that he put away popular applause as his heavenly voice had commanded, he is said to have written behind the identity of William Shakespeare.
Shakespeare is a synonym for Apollo and Pallas Athena. They're both known as shakers of the spear in classical tradition, and the spear represents a ray of light, a ray of wisdom, and they shake that spear at the dragon of ignorance. Exactly what Ben Jonson says in his preface to the Shakespeare Folio, to shake a lance at the dragon of ignorance. And this is the role of an Apollo or Pallas Athena. And they have always been the muses of the other 9 muses, who themselves are the muses of all the writers, poets, artists, and so on in history. So Apollo and Athena are the great inspirers. They're the great Shakespeares.
Bacon incorporated these Greek gods within a key symbol, the AA headpiece representing Apollo and Athena. Usually one of the A's is shaded, denoting a light and dark side. This symbol is found printed at the head of certain pages within the Shakespeare folio and among the acknowledged works of Francis Bacon. Of the two polarities, Apollo and Athena, it was Athena that seemed to dominate Bacon's imagination.
Pallas Athena was, she shook her spear at the eyes of ignorance, so she was the spear shaker. Now, she's always been known as the spear shaker. That was long before the time of Bacon. Back to the Greeks, the spear shaker. So he took that name, spear shaker, just turned it around to make it Shakespeare, and it used to be written with a hyphen, and then it became one word, Shakespeare, as the name of the playwright for those Shakespearean plays.
But what of the real William Shakespeare, the Stratford man whose name has been revered for nearly 500 years? His writings have been attributed to a number of other authors, including the playwright Christopher Marlowe, Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, and even Queen Elizabeth herself. But Sir Francis Bacon seems to lead the pack of would-be bards, with well over 200 books, essays, and pamphlets on the subject, many of which insist he is the real and true Shakespeare. Meanwhile, Baconian scholars argue that the Stratford man simply lacked the experience and education to have written the works that bear his name.
There is a mystery, because when you look at the plays, everything that's in them and what lies behind them in terms of experience, knowledge, and so on like that's expressed through the plays, and the philosophy in the plays, and so on like that, they do not match up with what we know of the life of the actor. In fact, the life of the actor is quite well known. It's quite a lot of research been done on William Shakespeare Stratford. So a lot is known about his life, and none of it matches up what you can deduce from the author from the plays themselves. In fact, the more we find out about the life of the actor, the worse it gets.
Here you have a guy who is barely literate enough to make a mark, much less write his name. His mark was only existent in 5 documents. There's not a single letter either from him or to him by any of his contemporaries. How can this guy have written the greatest literary works in the history of the world? It just didn't happen.
Whoever's the author certainly knew about certain things happening abroad in the royal courts, in France, in Italy, and in Spain.
Not only taught the workings of the court, but the intrigues as well, and who would know that? Certainly not a play actor like the William Shakespeare. There's no way that man could have known the intrigues that went on inside the court. But Francis Bacon did. He was well familiar with it. He was brought up in the court.
You can't just say, oh, genius did it all. It's impossible for genius alone to do that. You've got to have all that background, experience, knowledge, and so on, to get something like the Shakespeare plays.
There's even a quote from one of the justices, one of the English justices, that it's clear that from the Shakespeare writings that the author had to be an attorney because there is not a single legal error contained in any of them.
The author writes naturally as if he's a lawyer. It doesn't just put in legal terms here and there just to suit the story. It just legal terms and the whole legal jargon just rolls off him absolutely naturally, as if he's used to living in that environment all the time. Well, that doesn't fit the actor from Stratford.
There's just no way the historic William Shakespeare could have written these plays.
There's only one person who could possibly be the author of those plays, which is Francis Bacon.
Yet wouldn't the colossal size of all the plays, poems, and sonnets be too much for Bacon himself to complete, especially while becoming a lawyer, launching modern science, and writing the many other works attributed to him? This could be where the Knights of the Helmet took part, as evidence suggests that the plays may have been the collective effort of Bacon's literary society.
We know from historical records that Bacon actually had a literary group around him. Some of them were actually paid, employed by him, and others just did it voluntarily. A big group. Why? Why did he do that? You don't employ a lot of people, or writers, poets, artists, and as well as cipher experts and so on. You don't employ them for nothing. So what do they do? And then you get the answer, the Shakespeare plays, because scholars have found out there's been other contributions in the plays from other poets and so on, have all put a little bit in here and there. And then you find that they were either associated with or employed by Bacon. In that group, they're all part of this one group. So then the picture emerges of a typical Renaissance studio, but instead of being an artist, a painter with his studio of pupils, you've got a writer with his studio of pupils working with him. They each contribute a little bit to the picture or the story, but the main artist or author is Francis Bacon himself.
But in the town of Stratford-upon-Avon, people come from all over the world to view the birthplace of the man considered to be the greatest literary mind of all time. In Stratford, they hold a strong view against the suggestion that Shakespeare was anyone but himself.
It's a conspiracy theory, and it's all aimed at toppling the greatest writer who's ever lived.
There is a Shakespearean trust in England, and these are people who are dedicated to the cause of supporting and maintaining that William Shakespeare, the actor, was the actual playwright. I think it's highly unlikely.
Dr. Paul Edmondson is the head of education at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust in Stratford-upon-Avon. In this debate, he is known as a Stratfordian, not just because of where he lives, but because of his traditional view of Shakespeare. The Stratfordians are considered the academic adversaries of Baconians. We asked Dr. Edmondson to comment on the Bacon-Shakespeare theory.
It first occurred in 1785. A vicar just outside Stratford got to the age of 80, and then there's some report of him burning the papers that he'd been working on, as if in his later years he just kind of renounced any theory that he had about Bacon. It was taken up in 1856 by, what a surprise, Delia Bacon, no descendant, but she wanted to prove that Bacon wrote the plays. She even went as far as having herself locked in Holy Trinity Church to dig up the grave of Shakespeare, convinced that some manuscripts would have been inside the grave saying, "I did not write the plays, it was Bacon instead." And she didn't get as far as digging up the corpse of Shakespeare, and later she went mad after the publication of her book. But her book was groundbreaking. She had good support from Nathaniel Hawthorne, Mark Twain. She knew literary figures in the States.
Mark Twain was certainly convinced that the historic William Shakespeare did not write the Shakespeare plays, and this is a guy. How can you deny his conclusions? He had the money to investigate it. He had the time to investigate it. He's not known as a crackpot in any other venue.
In 1909, Twain took up the Bacon-Shakespeare controversy with his own book titled Is Shakespeare Dead?, in which he questions the reputation of the Stratford actor in his lifetime.
He's saying that in Shakespeare's own life, no one regarded him as being important or famous or a brilliant playwright or anything like that. It was only 2 or 3 generations after his death that suddenly the historic William Shakespeare became a big deal. So however, the plays enjoyed immediate success and immediate prominence. So how do you explain that?
That's simply not true. There's all sorts of evidence that he died and that he was remembered after his death. First of all, there's the very significant memorial bust in Holy Trinity Church, which not only is an early likeness of Shakespeare to give us a sense of what the man actually looked like, but it also mentions him as a great writer on the inscription of the monument, "See living art, but paid to serve his wit." I'm paraphrasing there, but it mentions living art and looking at the page rather than the monument, which is an echo of, or prefigures, possibly, the commendatory verse of Ben Jonson, Shakespeare's friend and contemporary playwright, at the front of the first folio. The first folio is the first time Shakespeare's works are gathered together after his death by his friends. That's crucial.
What is equally crucial is that the two tributes mentioned by Dr. Edmondson did not come about until years after Shakespeare's death. Other great writers of the time, like poet Ben Jonson, were given more immediate recognition within months of their passing. Just as importantly, the great folio assembled by Shakespeare's friends 7 years after his death contains what many believe to be some important clues. 19th century author W.F.C. Wigston referred to William Shakespeare as Phantom Captain Shakespeare, the Rosicrucian Mask. This may have been partly due to the world-famous Droeshout portrait that appears on the front of the original Great Folio of 1623. Note the presence of a line extending from the jawline of Shakespeare to the bottom of his left ear, as if to suggest the face were simply a mask. If this seems far-fetched, consider the dedication which appears beside it, written by poet Ben Jonson, a friend of both Shakespeare and Sir Francis Bacon. With a rather mysterious twist, Jonson concludes with the words, "Reader, look not on his picture, but his book." Why would Ben Jonson point the reader away from the face of Shakespeare and compel men to look upon the book instead? A dedication that seems to parallel the monument at Holy Trinity Church.
On the inscription of the monument, "See living art, but paid to serve his wit." I'm paraphrasing there, but it mentions living art and looking at the page rather than the monument.
Are these allusions made by the men who knew the real William Shakespeare, that he was simply a mask or frontman for Francis Bacon?
Bacon paid him off to go and keep his mouth shut.
The monument at Holy Trinity Church refers to the page that serves Shakespeare's wit. But when one looks upon the page beneath his hand, it turns out to be blank. Some Baconians believe this is a secret code, alerting the reader that the Stratford man himself wrote nothing. The empty page is said to match the empty expression on the face of Shakespeare, who Baconians argue could barely write his name.
It's actually a big embarrassment to, you could say, the academic fraternity that believed the actor wrote the plays.
The question of Shakespeare's literacy is often mentioned because of the few known signatures he left behind. As one writer puts it, the scrawling, uncertain method of their execution stamps Shakespeare as unfamiliar with the use of a pen.
Perhaps a modern equivalent of this is to say, how good is your signature on your credit card? How good is your signature when you sign your name in a shop or on a bank transaction or whatever? There are several signatures which survive of Shakespeare. How good would you like them to be?
While Baconians argue that Shakespeare lacked experience, Edmondson points out that, as the son of a glove maker, he was uniquely qualified.
There's lots of references to different kinds of leather. For example, Feste's line in Act 3, Scene 1 of Twelfth Night about someone's wit being like a cheverel glove. Cheverel, as the son of a glove maker, Shakespeare would have known, is a kind of kid skin which stretches and stretches and stretches when you're making the gloves. It's a very soft, supple material to work with. And here you have it immersed in the wordplay of one of Shakespeare's clowns. Francis Bacon knew nothing about different kinds of leather, I would suggest. Actually, you could turn this whole thing on its head and say that Shakespeare wrote bacon, which is something that a lot of people don't suggest, because why bother to do it that way around?
One of the problems is the Shakespearean trust is that while these objections come up to William Shakespeare being the author of the plays, they refuse to investigate the contrary evidence which has been put forward to them. They refuse to look into it. They refuse to look into the cipher codes that Bacon incorporated in the first folios, for instance.
Bacon uses this cipher in the Shakespeare work and his own, and in the work under his own name. But he also, in doing that, signs his name and the name of the Rosicrucian fraternity.
This code system of writing he used all his entire life.
The examination of the cipher codes in Shakespeare's plays have filled hundreds of books and essays over the last few centuries. But perhaps the most specific evidence are the presence of Baconian and Rosicrucian emblems in the Great Folio of 1623 and in earlier works by Shakespeare. Bacon's light A and dark A symbol appears, representing the two Shakespeares, Apollo and Athena. Meanwhile, this Rosicrucian emblem, featuring the god Pan, is found prominently throughout the work. Other mystical headpieces with Rosicrucian symbolism are found both in the Shakespeare Folio of 1623 and in works openly published by Sir Francis Bacon. The varied symbols and ciphers clearly mark the presence of Bacon and his Rosicrucian fraternity, while to what extent they were involved in the writing of the plays remains a matter of debate. But perhaps the most compelling evidence is that the works of Shakespeare helped to accomplish exactly what Bacon and his Knights of the Helmet set out to achieve. While the numbers vary, the plays are said to have developed some 20,000 words for the English language, with some words being created, older words being revived, and current words being used in new ways. Could the actor from Stratford, with a limited education, have accomplished this coincidentally? The Shakespeare controversy was illustrated quite clearly by Masonic author Manly P. Hall in his book, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, where he reveals the veiled purpose behind the writing of the plays. He says, Sir Francis Bacon, the Rosicrucian initiate, wrote into the Shakespearean plays the secret teachings of the fraternity of the Rose and Cross, and the true rituals of the Masonic order. The Bacon-Shakespeare controversy involves the most profound aspects of science, religion, and ethics. He who solves its mystery may yet find therein the key to the supposedly lost wisdom of antiquity. The lost wisdom that Hall refers to is said to have begun in ancient Atlantis. Is this the real key to understanding Shakespeare? Incredibly, it may be said that the plays themselves represent the whole confusion of America's foundation. For while Shakespeare contains a clear representation of Christianity, with some 1,200 biblical references, along with them are plays with openly pagan and magical themes. Like the symbol of the Rose and Cross, the plays combine the teachings of Christianity with the wisdom of the mystery religion.